Hello. Today we're going to discuss the Chicano movement and its deep roots in the state of Colorado. The Chicano movement, also called the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, or El Movimiento, was a civil rights movement with the stated goal of achieving Mexican American empowerment and equality, similar to that of the Black Power movement of the 1960s. While many have recognized the achievements of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers and the impact they had on migrant workers in California, the contributions and sacrifices that Colorado activists made to the movement have largely gone unnoticed. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the important role that Colorado activists played in the larger movement for Chicano civil rights. Now, in order to examine the Chicano movement in Colorado, it is important to first take a step back and look at the political climate of the 1960s and some of the legislation that it inspired. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty legislation really marks the beginning of the Chicano movement in Colorado because for the first time it made social mobility viable for a majority of Colorado Hispanics. Also, as I go on talking throughout this lecture, you'll notice that I may use various terms interchangeably. I'll use the term Hispanic, Latino, Mexicano, all of which are referring to Mexican Americans living within Colorado. And I always like to quote my friend Vincent de Baca when he says, "At various times I've called myself a Hispano, a Mexicano, a Mexican American, Chicano, an American, and I dare say sometimes I even think I'm a human being." So just know going forward that a lot of those terms will be used interchangeably. Now, kind of the cornerstone of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty was the Economic Opportunity Act. This was the centerpiece of the legislation. This motivated government agencies, nonprofits, university departments, church programs, and individuals to enact programs that reduced the effects of poverty. Rural Colorado Hispanics had previously been reserved to a life of migrant labor, directly benefited from these types of programs. Also, the Migrant Action Program, also known as MAP, in 1967, this was influenced by the overall philosophy of the War on Poverty. This Migrant Action Program was created at CU. It was run by the university and federally funded through the Educational Opportunity Program that we just discussed above. Now, prior to MAP, the Migrant Action Program, the few Latinos who attended the university came almost entirely from landowning families in southern Colorado or northern New Mexico. Most of these rather rich families identified more with Anglo students on campus, not even so much so with the smaller number of African or Asian students on campus. Now, they believed that these many talented Latino children in Colorado who came from poor families had gone to mediocre schools, especially the children of farm workers. They believed they could succeed in higher education if unnecessary rigid admissions requirements were modified and if they received sufficient financial aid and good advising. Now, MAP's organizers went out to recruit students actively. They worked recruiting students initially with agricultural families in the San Luis Valley. And MAP representatives told prospective students that they could be accepted into the university without the usual requirements that would be given for financial aid. Once on campus, they were supposed to receive extra academic and personal support because most of these Migrant Action Program recipients were very much untraditional students, often the first in their families to ever attend a university. Now, these new Chicano students on their college campuses were active not only on campus but also in town as they tried to raise awareness about the wider causes of the day. And of course, one of the main wider causes of the day was, of course, the civil rights movement. In 1968, UMass, the United Mexican American Student Union, began at the University of Colorado. Now, this began with about 6 students. UMass was originally organized by MAP students, Migrant Action Program students, and the organization's role was to create a community that would promote academic success. Also, UMass happened to be the most politically active student organization on campus, and many Migrant Action Program and UMass students hung out together. They hung together for support in often an unwelcoming academic, economic, and cultural world that was unlike what they had previously known. Now, one inspiring example, a rather moving story of a Migrant Action Program student's acceptance and arrival at the University of Colorado is told by Cleopatra Jaramillo through the Boulder County Oral History Project. Cleo grew up in Center, Colorado, a very small community in the San Luis Valley in Colorado that is dominated by large commercial farms owned by white landowners. Her father was employed at the local lumber yard, and her mother worked the fields, both good jobs by local standards. Cleo and all of her 7 siblings, when they were not in school, thinned and weeded lettuce in the spring and summer, and they hoed and dug potatoes in the fall. Cleo always did very well through school, and she did very well in high school. And she had hoped one day that she might be able to save up enough money to go to Adams State College in the San Luis Valley. Though there was no teacher or counselor at her school who ever suggested that she could go to college at all. In August of 1969, just a few months after her high school graduation, Cleo was approached while working in the fields by her Aunt Jenny. Her Aunt Jenny was a known community organizer for the Economic Opportunity Program in Center, and also was volunteering with the United Farm Workers at the time. Now, Jenny had heard that the University of Colorado had started a program of special scholarships for the children of farm workers and had nominated Cleo without her knowledge. She had just been notified that Cleo was accepted. "You're going to college," she announced, to Cleo's total surprise. A few weeks later, Jenny took Cleo to Boulder, where she registered and became a member of the Migrant Action Program and of the United Mexican American Student Union, UMass. Cleo was amazed at how undemanding her life as a student was compared to her life working in fields. And you can kind of see this in this quote here where she says, "I started taking classes and I thought, man, this is so easy. If people even knew how hard it is to go from row to row in the fields all day long, but here you get to read a book. Who knew that Boulder existed and that people were treated like kings and queens here?" So that's kind of just exemplifying a stark difference between the previous life of many of these Migrant Action Program recipients and the world that they gained access to through the University of Colorado. Now, thanks to the inclusive environment created at CU in conjunction with UMass, migrant students enjoyed a 95% success rate, with most students graduating in 4 years. You can compare that to 6 years on average it takes an undergraduate to earn a bachelor's degree today at UCCS even. So this is remarkably impressive. Now, at the same time, well, Migrant Action Program students were being accepted to the Boulder campus, a larger Chicano movement was also mobilizing in Denver. In 1969, a social studies teacher at West High School in Denver made some disparaging anti-Mexican remarks openly in class. This incident led to the West High School walkout on March 20th and 21st. In this and other walkouts, Denver students demanded curriculum reforms, including instruction about the history, culture, and contribution of Chicanos. They also demanded amnesty for students who walked out. These walkouts really gave birth to the Chicano studies programs being created at universities. Prior to these demands, ethnic and Chicano studies programs were not offered at all at most mainstream universities. Also at this same time, a gentleman in Colorado named Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, a former boxer, poet, and political activist, Um, he led the expansion of the Crusade for Justice. The Crusade for Justice were generating not only strong support in Denver, but also strong opposition, especially from law enforcement at the time. Now, the Crusade for Justice from the 1960s to the 1980s was a full blown, comprehensive civil rights organization, or as Corky Gonzalez called it, a human rights organization. It provided a full array of community services, including employment, legal defense, education, civil rights, political action, immigration, and recreation. Chicanos and others who had problems, especially with the police or schools or on the job, came to the Crusade for Justice headquarters for help, comfort, and relief. The Crusade building at 16th Avenue and Downing Street in Denver, near the current Auraria campus, had a bookstore, a churro shop, a large lunchroom, a boxing gym, an auditorium, 24 classrooms, lounge, art studios, print shops. It was known to house one of the finest Mexican ballet groups outside of Mexico, and it also housed a school program that taught students from preschool all the way to undergraduate college programs. The Crusade for Justice also hosted 3 national Chicano youth conferences in Denver in 1969, 1970, and 1971. And from the first conference came what was called El Plan Espiritual de Aztlan. And this really set the goals for the broader national Chicano movement. So this really highlights what an important place Denver was at the peak of this Chicano movement. It was kind of a focal point, a gathering point for many of these activist youths. Now, at the same time this was going on, Cesar Chavez was also organizing farm workers' strikes in the San Luis Valley, and the United Farm Workers had instituted a national boycott on items that included grapes grown in California, Safeway stores, and of course Coors beer that had a major impact here in Colorado. And the reason that Coors beer was involved is because Pete Coors at the time, the CEO of Coors, was outspokenly anti-Mexican. He made various disparaging remarks regarding the movement and actually verbally attacked many of the movement's leaders. And not only that, Coors put a lot of money into the movements that were against the United Farm Workers. So this caused an impetus for many Latinos, not just in Colorado, but nationally, to boycott Coors beer. So this is just kind of paints the picture of what was going on, not just in greater Colorado, but also nationally. We had Corky Gonzalez here in Colorado. We had Cesar Chavez, really nationally, but kind of focused in California. And here you can see a photo of Cesar Chavez talking with Corky Gonzalez. And then at the bottom here, you'll see a couple of photos depicting some strikes for the United Farm Workers. The one on the left is actually a Coors boycott. Now, at this same time, this movement begins to erupt in Boulder amongst United Mexican American Student Union, the UMass students, many of whom families were involved in this greater United Farm Workers strike in rural Colorado. So, kind of just a timeline of how this movement progressed within Boulder and at CU. In 1968, there were only about 50 Mexican American students enrolled at the University of Colorado. By the summer of 1969, UMass summer programs had begun, and thanks to UMass and the Migrant Action Program, Chicano enrollment grew to over 1,400. Now, by 1970, President Nixon was elected to the presidency, and he actually began dismantling Lyndon Johnson's Economic Opportunity Act. So in 1971, CU also began to dismantle the United Mexican American Student Union, and this sparked widespread campus unrest. Students and faculty at CU, many of whom wanted UMass removed because they actually labeled UMass and the Migrant Action Program as racist because the funding was not also going to white students. So by 1972, there's a lot of upheaval taking place in the University of Colorado campus regarding the elimination of UMass and the Migrant Action Program. And CU orders Pat Vigil, director of UMass, to fire the Chicano activist Ricardo Falcon, who was a really charismatic and popular student leader at the time. Now, Vigil flat out refuses to fire Falcon, who he believed was critical in the expansion of UMass and the overall success of the Migrant Action Program at the University of Colorado. So CU decided to fire both Vigil and Falcon in response. In response to these firings, the students rallied in support of Falcon and Vigil. And these rallies are led by student activists Priscilla Falcon, the wife of Ricardo Falcon, Florencio Granado, and Roberto Turan. Now, those are important names that are going to come up later, so it's important that you guys kind of keep those names in the forefront of your mind. But because of these three students' involvement in the defense of Vigil and Falcon, CU responded by also expelling these three students. So you had two CU employees who were fired, and then also the three students who came out in support of them also being removed from the school. So by fall of 1973, the financial aid to the Economic Opportunity Program was significantly delayed, and the UMass students decided to take over Regent Hall, demanding their financial aid. This actually worked and causes CU to cave, reinstating the financial aid to these students. Aid back. In fall of 1974, CU once again began taking systematic steps to dismantle UMass, the United Mexican American Student Union, and MAP, the Migrant Action Program, at CU. Among the first of these steps was to appoint Joe Franco as director of the program. While Franco was Hispanic, students believed that he did not truly have the interests of the community at heart and served essentially as a yes man to the university. In the eyes of activists, Franco needed to be removed. To this end, they occupied temporary building number 1, TB number 1, the former UMass headquarters, where they remained for 18 days. During this time, the occupancy grew from 8 students to over 80 UMass students, and the Boulder Police Department had to seek the help of FBI snipers to gain control of the situation. On May 30th, 1974, the occupation ends after CU agrees to negotiations with UMass students. But this only takes place after violence ensues. On May 27th, 1974, while temporary building number 1 was still being occupied by UMass students, an explosion can be heard throughout Boulder. The smoldering remains of a car are found at Chautauqua Park, not far from the CU campus. 3 Chicano student organizers who were directly involved in the temporary building number 1 occupation are killed instantly. These students are Neva Romero, a 21-year-old CU junior, Una Jacola, a 24-year-old CU double major, and Reyes Martinez, a 26-year-old CU law school graduate and Alamosa civil rights attorney. Just 2 days later, another explosion occurs at a local liquor store, killing 3 more Chicano activists involved in student protests at temporary building number 1. These students are Francisco Daughtry, 20-year-old Texas pre-med student, Herberto Turan, a 31-year-old former CU student, and Florencio Granado, a 31-year-old who had attended CU. And this is a image that was left at the scene of the second bombing. It's also one of the very few pictures of the scenes of the bombings that exist. But this was left at the scene, inscribed with, "Upon these ruins, we will build a movement 10,000 times stronger." Now, the view from the media and the government surrounding these two bombings in Boulder was that Neva Romero was probably holding the bomb when it detonated. This is despite ample evidence that they were just going on a quick beer run and were actually parked in the parking lot of a local liquor store at the time. The media actually characterized these activists as violent radicals who died making their own bombs, and they claimed that many radicals were bombing places all over the nation at the time, which was somewhat true, so why would this be any different? Now, the bombing shook the Chicano community and really had the impact of halting the Chicano movement in Colorado when coupled with the Crusade for Justice bombing that we discussed earlier. Many Chicano activists believe that Los Seis de Boulder were the victims of the FBI's COINTELPRO program, who were involved in the assassination of Black Panthers and American Indian movement leaders. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was a series of covert and at times illegal projects conducted by the United States FBI aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting American political organizations. FBI records show that COINTELPRO resources targeted groups and individuals that the FBI deemed, quote, subversive. So it's really no stretch of the imagination that these Chicano activists would have been investigated by this program, because based on existing documents that have been declassified, Corky Gonzalez in Denver, as well as Cesar Chavez and many of the key Chicano movement leaders within Colorado were directly being investigated under the COINTELPRO program. Now, the investigation surrounding these two bombings was incredibly sloppy and, by a lot of accounts, very biased. There was actually a lot of flesh left at the scene of the crime, and the FBI would let random people onto the crime scene. People today still have parts of the car that were never entered into evidence. This questionability surrounding these two bombings sparked a grand jury investigation, which actually declared the investigation itself, quote, racist, although there was not enough evidence to convict anyone. Now, there exists a pattern affecting the same groups of people raising questions surrounding the involvement of COINTELPRO. Turan and Granado were both expelled from CU for student activism, and after the first bombing, Granado declared war on the United States, saying, quote, "These people were murdered by the US government. It is our job to avenge them." The very next day, he is killed. Neva Romero was the first Latina elected to CU student government, and Reyes Martinez's brother was on the run from the FBI in Mexico, and his family was very well known to law enforcement agencies. There were also 3 bombs that were set off prior to the 2 that killed these students, although in these 3 bombs no one was injured. After the second bombing, there was also talk of, quote, a package being thrown into a car that is heard over police scanners. And unfortunately, none of this can be investigated the same way that, say, the Black Panthers were in their association with COINTELPRO through the release of documents, because all the FBI investigation records surrounding these 2 bombings in Boulder were burned in an FBI file holding center in Kansas in 1981. This is a mysterious fire that was never really investigated, and it was just deemed an accident. So there's not any real recourse to investigate these bombings via declassified government documents. Um, that likely would have been very helpful because we have found out that the FBI was targeting and assassinating people involved with the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers, and we were able to clear that up through declassified documents. But unfortunately, in this case, they had been burned. Now, the Los Seis de Boulder, the 6 students who were killed in the 2 car bombings, were just 6 of 9 activists killed during the Chicano movement within Colorado. And they are considered very much martyrs amongst civil rights activists in Colorado and throughout the larger Chicano movement. And this is just a commemorative issue of a newspaper titled La Cucaracha, which was actually a Chicano movement newspaper during the Chicano movement. But they released this commemorative issue in 2014 celebrating the 9 martyrs that were killed in connection to the Colorado Chicano movement. Now today, the Los Seis de Boulder, the 6 activists killed in Boulder, are still celebrated every year in May, along with the individuals who were active in occupying temporary building number 1. At the bottom there, you see a photo of some of the students who initially occupied that building. They come back every year to celebrate the lives of the 6 students who were lost in these bombings, and also the legacy of the Chicano movement. And I'm going to go ahead and end today with a short corrido celebrating Los Seis de Boulder. And for those of you who don't know, a corrido is a Mexican story song that really commemorates an event or an issue. So I'm going to go ahead and play that, and we will end this lecture.
Voy a cantar un corrido que en Colorado pasó. Murieron los 6 de Boulder 2 noches en mayo 74. Era una noche ocupada cuando de pronto llegó ese bombazo hieloso, como a las 8, 3 vidas llevó. Amaneció en la mañana, ahí en la sierra yo vi la alma de Neva Romero, subiendo hacia el cielo, subiendo hasta el fin. En este cielo de sierra de Colorado se ven las almas de 6 soldados, 6 fusilados, 6 hijos del bien. Cuando se acaba